Welcome back to the Female Property Expert podcast. I'm your host, Emma Morby, and today we're going to delve into a topic that might seem a little daunting, but it is absolutely crucial for any property investor. That is the UK planning system. Whether you're new to property, you've got a few deals under your belt, or you're experienced, understanding how the planning system works and how to use it to your advantage can make the world of difference to your success. And in this episode, I'm going to break down the different types of planning, explain a bit about why planning is important and why it's in place, and offer some practical tips on how to navigate it effectively. So if you haven't already, grab yourself a cuppa or a glass of wine, and let's get started. First things first, what exactly is the UK planning system? So simply put, it's a framework of laws and regulations that govern how land and buildings are used or developed. So the system is in place to ensure that development happens in a way that's kind of sustainable and that it's safe and that it's in line with the needs of that community. Planning isn't just about stopping people from building whatever they like, wherever they like. It's about creating spaces that people can live, work, and enjoy. It's a balance, I suppose, of needs of the individuals, the property developers, and those of the actual wider community and the environment themselves. So why should you care about the planning system as a property investor? Well, the simple reason is the planning process is where your ideas meet reality. It's the point at which your grand vision for a property or land is either given the green light or it's sent back to the drawing board. So without the right planning permission, your project cannot move forwards. And even if you manage to complete a project without proper planning approval, you could face hefty fines, legal action, or even enforcement action, which will make you undo all of the work you've done, costing you an absolute fortune. So in other words, understanding the planning system isn't just important, it's actually essential. Now, we can't cover everything about the whole planning system in this podcast, but we do have a section on our training which covers in detail everything about planning. Now, I'm going to dive into the different types of planning permission and the consent you might encounter. So each serves a different purpose, and understanding these can help you avoid kind of necessary delays or complications. As an example, I often see people applying for full planning when actually they can use their permitted development rights, which I'm going to explain a bit about now. So let's start with the good news, okay? Not every development requires full planning permission. Under the UK's permitted development rights, your PDR, certain types of work can be carried out without the need for full planning application. Now, this includes things like small extensions, loft conversions, the change of use of a certain type of building. However, there are limits to what you can do under your permitted development rights. So, for example, there are restrictions on the size of extension that you can build, and there are rules about how close you can build to your property's boundaries. Plus, if your property is in a conservation area or it's a listed building, your permitted development rights might not apply full stop. So while permitted development rights can save you time and hassle, it's important to know exactly what is and isn't allowed. Next, full planning permission. For anything that falls outside your permitted development rights, you're going to need to apply for a full planning permission. This is the standard route, if I'm honest, for most property developments, whether you're building something new or you're making a significant alteration to an existing building, or even if you're changing the use of that. The process involves, and this is a very light touch that I'm going to explain, there's obviously a lot more detail in it, but the process involves submitting detailed plans to your local planning authority, or LPA, which will then be considered with things like the impact on the environment, local infrastructure, and the neighbouring properties. It's a very detailed process, and it can take several months to get a decision. We've had things that have taken nearly 2 years, especially during COVID, to get a decision. That was also on a listed building, though. Next, you'll have outline planning permission. So outline planning permission is a bit different. It's used when you want to see if a project's likely to be approved before you actually invest too much time and money into detailed plans. Essentially, I suppose it's a way to get a yes in principle from the local planning authority. And then you have to sort out the finer details that can be worked out later through an actual application, a planning application, that is. Now, this can be incredibly useful if you're considering larger developments or a project where you're not sure yet of all the details. Just bear in mind that if you get outline permission, you're still going to need to go back and get full planning permission for the specific details of that project later on. You often see outline planning permission being used where someone has a field and they want to put 12 houses on it. So they've gone for outline planning permission because their aim is literally just to flip that with planning permission. And they don't want to apply for full planning because it costs a lot of money and time. So they apply for outline planning to work out if it works first. If you get a yes in principle, then they're going to move forward with full planning, and then they're going to sell that site without building it out with full planning. Next is change of use applications. So if you're planning to change the way a building is used, say from a shop to a residential flat, you may need to apply for a change of use. Now, some changes are covered under your permitted development rights, but others require full planning permission. It's important to check the use class of your building and see if the change you want to make is permitted. Now, this can be especially important in areas where local authorities want to protect certain types of businesses or community spaces. We're going to move to listed building consent. If you're lucky enough to be dealing with listed buildings, you'll need special consent to make any changes to it. Now, listed buildings are protected because of their historical or architectural significance. And any alterations, inside and out, by the way, require careful consideration. I love listed buildings. And if you know me, you'll know that I love the heritage side of listed buildings. But it's not for the faint-hearted. Listed building consent is separate from planning permission, okay? So you'll need to apply for both if your project requires it. The rules around listed buildings are very strict, and the penalties for unauthorized work can be severe. So it's crucial to get it right first time. And next, there's conservation area consent. Fairly new to this. I've worked within conservation areas and I tend to get it from the planning system itself. But similar to listed building consent, conservation area consent is required for certain types of work in conservation areas. Now, these areas are designated for their special architectural or historic interest, and the aim is to preserve their character. So if your property is in a conservation area, you may face additional restrictions on what you can do, particularly with regards to demolishing buildings or altering the appearance of a property. And sometimes you'll see this where they've got a facade on the front of the property, and actually you can knock down the whole property behind it, but the facade has to remain. Now, using the planning system to your advantage is key. So now that we've covered the basics of what bits of planning, you may be required to get, let's talk about how you can use the planning system to your advantage as a property investor. Here are some tips to help you navigate the process effectively. Number one, do your research. Before you even think about buying a property, make sure you understand the planning requirements for that type of project that you want to undertake. Check the local plan and any neighbourhood plans for that area, which will give you a good idea of what the local planning authority is likely to approve. It's also worth looking at previous planning applications in the area, if there have been similar projects that have been approved in the street or in the area, and if there's been any rejected as well. So you can learn a lot from those rejected decisions, because then you can know what they don't like and put in what they do like. Number two, engage with your local planning authority early. A lot of people don't do this, and I don't understand why. So one of the biggest mistakes as an investor is waiting until it's too late in the process to engage with the local planning authority. Instead, try to get them on board early. Pre-application discussions can be incredibly valuable. Yes, they're going to cost you money, but incredibly valuable. It gives you a chance of feedback, I suppose, for your plans and addresses any concerns before you submit the application. You can also invite them out to site if you're doing multiple projects and see if they want to come out and give their professional opinion on what can and cannot happen on that site. Again, it's going to cost you, but it's worth it. Now, This can save you a lot of time and money in the long run, and it does help reduce the risk of your application being rejected or delayed, if I'm honest. So decide to work with the local planning authority early. Next, I'd suggest work with professionals. So unless you're an expert in planning law, which I am not, I know a lot about it, but I'm not an expert, it's a good idea to work with professionals who know that system inside out. This might include architects, planning consultants, legal advisors, because they can all help you navigate the process. They also help you avoid common pitfalls, and they present your application in the best possible light. Yes, there are costs involved, but the potential savings in both the time and the stress are well worth it. I'm going to give you an example. We recently brought a barn for conversion, and it already had planning permission on it, but we wanted to make some alterations. One of those alterations were that the local planning authority had removed all permitted development rights, which they weren't legally allowed to do. But because the people who we brought it from didn't know that, they sold it with restrictions in place. So with the help of my planning consultant, we went back into the local planning authority and said, hey, look, we want to make some minor amendments, but also we want you to give us all of our permitted development rights back, because this was a full planning application and not a Class Q conversion of an agricultural building. They then subsequently came back and had to relinquish all permitted development rights because they weren't legally allowed to remove them. Now, that means I can add a 50% extension. It means I can add a porch. It means I can add Velux windows. It means a lot of things for me. And it gives me a lot more room to play with that barn should I want to. As it happens, we don't need to. But it also means that when we come to sell it, it holds a lot more weight that they still have their permitted development right. So that's a prime example where the local authority have used powers that they don't have to restrict a planning application. And that's why I work with professionals. Next, point 4, be prepared to negotiate. So planning applications don't always go through smoothly on the first attempt. And let me tell you, I've experienced this. Sometimes the local planning authority will have concern or suggest changes to your plans. So you've got to be prepared to negotiate and make compromises where necessary. We had this with a site down in Plymouth. We wanted to build flats on a road of a grade 2 listed curtilage building. And they came out and said, no, we would prefer houses. We'd like 4 houses. Now, initially, we didn't think we'd get houses agreed because it was in the curtilage of a listed building. But when they came out, they said, yeah, no, houses are what we want you to put through. And lo and behold, we got what we wanted. But if we'd put the application in without any form of negotiation with them, we would have gone in for flats, and it's possible it would have been refused. So remember, the goal is to get your project approved. So it's better to work with the local planning authority rather than against them or without them having any knowledge of you. Flexibility can be your friend in the planning process. Yes, it takes longer, but it can get you what you want in the long term if you're more flexible. And the last tip I'd like to suggest to you is consider the long-term potential. When evaluating a property deal, think about the long-term planning potential. Even if the property isn't ideal right now, could changes in local planning policies make it a more valuable site in the future? For example, areas earmarked for regeneration or infrastructure improvements can offer greater opportunities for that savvy investor who's looking for it, who is willing to play the long game, maybe 12 months or 24 months, because they know that that particular field is going to fall within an employment sector or fall within the residential sector. So when they grow the settlement boundary for that particular town or that particular village. So considering the long-term potential is important. And we had this with a block of 14 flats we converted. There were 13 flats and 1 estate office. And the reason the estate office was put into place was to reduce SIL, but also because if they'd gone into 14 flats, it would have meant there would have been a section 106 attached to it, which is social housing. So the planning that was put in was for 13 flats and an estate office, which was the top floor. Once we'd converted all the flats and sold them, we were left with this 1 estate office. And we had to wait for 12 months to justify to them that actually no one wants to work in an estate office in a residential building on a residential street. It's not practical. So 12 months later, after demonstrating that we tried to rent it and no one wanted it, we went back in for full planning to convert that one particular estate office into a flat. So that's how you can utilize the planning system if you look slightly further afield and you imagine what you could potentially get within 12 months, for instance. Now, obviously, at the Female Property Expert, we understand that navigating the planning system is overwhelming if you're new, okay, especially if you're new to property investments. And it's why part of our training program includes that comprehensive guideline on planning and development. And for us, it's important. You can't go in learning all of these, skills for property investment, like rent to rent or buy to lets or planning developments, without actually having a really good base knowledge of the UK planning system. So to wrap up, okay, the UK planning system might seem complex, but it's really just a set of rules, basically designed to make sure the development happens in a way that benefits everyone, all parties. By understanding the different types of planning permission and actually how to navigate them properly, you can turn those rules to your advantage. And if I'm honest, you unlock the full potential of you as a property investor and also the property that you're investing in. Now, remember, I always say knowledge is power. And in property, it's also profit, okay? So it's not just power, it's the amount of money you can make at the back end of it. So take the time to learn about the planning system. Work with professionals. I accept that I don't have the vast knowledge that my planning consultant has. So I happily say, hey, look, could you deal with this planning application or could you deal with the permitted development right issue? Because they have that knowledge. Don't be afraid to engage with your local planning authority in advance. Yes, it might cost you some money, but it always helps. I've never heard someone say, oh, that was the most useless planning meeting I've ever had, ever. Okay? With the right approach, you can make the planning system work for you, for your project, and at the same time, learn so many different aspects of how you can get your project with planning or permitted development rights as quickly as possible. So thank you for joining me today on the Female Property Expert podcast. I do hope this episode has given you a clearer understanding of the UK planning system and also how you can use it to your advantage as a property investor. If you've enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe or leave a review. It's really lovely to read some reviews that you guys have left. And if you are ready to take your property journey to the next level and you would like to have support from a trainer, feel free to reach out to us. Just visit the Female Property Expert website, reach out to us, and we'll see if we can help support you and guide you along your journey. Until next time, happy investing.